Good morning, welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, episode number 202, Tales from Granton. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. And we have 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, Wick, Fort William and Portree, where we look after the historic records relating to this part of the world. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are very grateful for that, and I know that certainly many of you have done that, and it really is appreciated. So welcome to this week's episode. This week we are looking at Granton, but I wanted to start by thanking you for all the comments last week. Really nice to get comments on the hydro episode. As you know, it was one I was kind of building up to for a long time, getting my head around it. So really nice to hear from people who had thought they would find it really boring and then didn't. And also people who know a lot about it and felt that I'd done it justice. That's always a relief. So thank you for that. Also, just to start by sharing some lovely news that we got a mention in the council chambers last week at the Highland Council Chambers. Learn with Lorna was particularly mentioned in the Education Committee, along with the work of the whole of the Archive Service and Ambala, so that was really lovely. So this week we are continuing my series looking at some of the larger settlements and boroughs in the Highlands, and this episode is about Granton-on-Spey. Now, Granton is a little bit different in several ways to the other towns and boroughs that I've covered in this type of episode, and you'll see that as we go through why Granton's story is a bit different from those of Tain and Dornoch and Nairn and so on. Granton, as we know it today, has only existed for about 260 years. So that's one thing that's very different to, as I say, Dingwall and Inverness and so on. But it's also different in the way that it's got a foot in several places, unlike the other boroughs that we cover. It is in Highland, but historically it's part of Moray, so it has a kind of interest in both places, which is unlike anything else. It's situated about 20 miles southeast of Inverness, as the crow flies, about 35 miles by road, on the very eastern edge of the area that we cover. And its history is very much linked to the Earls of Seafield, the Ogilvy Grants, and particularly the Grants, whose connection to the area goes back centuries, hence the name Granton. The collection of archives which tell the story of that family, the Earls of Seafield, the enormous, extensive Seafield papers, are held in the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh, so I'm not going to use them for this episode. But if you're interested in finding out more about the family, then I'll share the reference number at the end for you if you want to pursue that there. So the Earls of Seafield held extensive estates, and also they had 2 seats. They had Cullen House in Cullen and on the Moray coast, which was the seat of the Ogilvies of Finlater, and Castle Grant, previously called Fruchie Castle, home of the Grants. Both of those buildings still exist, but neither are owned by the family, although the family does still own extensive estates across the north of Scotland. In 1694, after acquiring more land and more estates, again across the huge area of the north of Scotland, Sir Ludwig Grant consolidated all of these holdings into one holding, the Regality of Grant, and a Crown Charter to this effect was issued by William and Mary. And it was this charter that changed the name of Fruchie Castle to Castle Grant, and which made Castleton of Fruchie into a borough to be called the Regality Town of Grant, Grantown, giving huge power to the family over local justice and various other issues around local life. And we have references within our court papers to when it was called Grantown as 2 words. Now, I feel like you're going to think I've contradicted myself because I've said it's 260 years old, but I've also said that it had a charter in 1694. Well, what is absolutely remarkable to me is that despite being made a borough, and despite having a role within that regality, Old Granton, as it would become, is no longer in existence, and in fact it isn't even visible on the first edition Ordnance Survey map. It had all but disappeared by the 1820s. And I'm going to turn now to the book The Chiefs of Grant, written by William Fraser in 1883, to tell you what happened next, and where the Granton that we know today comes into the story. By the Charter of Erection of the Regality, as has been remarked, the castle town of Fruchy was changed into the borough and town of Grant, or Grantown. It was to be the principal borough of regality, containing a market cross from which proclamations might be made, also a toll booth and a jail. Borough authorities were to be constituted. From the references to the town and the cross of Granton in the court books of the regality already referred to, their existence then is established, so we know that this town existed. This village appears to have been nearer to Castle Grant than current Granton is, and to have been removed on the foundation of the new town. So we've got this old town of Granton, or village, established near Castle Grant as part of that 1694 charter. But the present town of Granton, however, is of a more modern date, having been projected in 1765 by Sir Ludwig Grant of Grant and his son, the good Sir James. The site of this town was formerly a barren heath moor. Plans and leases were prepared, and by 1766 the first houses were erected. It was especially the project of Sir James Grant, the good Sir James, and he used every means in his power to promote the prosperity of the town. Under his fostering care, it prospered greatly, and in 1780 it had become so important as to memorialise for the establishment of a post office and special mail service. Establishments for brewing and baking were set up, linen and woolen manufactories and a bleach field were commenced and carried on, and tradesmen of all kinds were encouraged to follow their crafts in the new town. Schools for boys and girls were erected, and as early as 1767 Sir James Grant had projected a technical school of arts to be maintained by voluntary contribution, where the children of artisans might be properly instructed in the process of linen and woolen manufacture and agriculture. So Granton-on-Spey, the Granton we know now, was founded in 1765 as a completely planned town. At that point it was just called Granton, or New Granton sometimes, and that market cross that I mentioned had been set up in the original Granton was moved across to New Granton. Adverts went out to seek tenants, so you can see in the newspapers of the day people them advertising that this new town is being set up, that it's completely new, all new buildings, and that people should apply to be resident. But also many were moved from areas of the Seafield estates which were undergoing agricultural reform. And businesses and industries were established to try and create a little industrial settlement. And this is how the first statistical account for the parish of Cromdale describes how that new town, founded in 1765, was doing by 1793 when it was published. So this is what they say. Granton is a village erected under the influence of the Grant family, it being little more than 20 years since the place where it stands was a poor rugged piece of heath. It now contains from 300 to 400 inhabitants, some of whom are as good tradesmen as any in the kingdom. Shoemakers, tailors, weavers of wool, linen and stockings, blacksmiths, wrights, masons and 12 merchants keep regular shops in it. There are 2 established schools, one of which some of the teaching money is paid by Sir James Grant, and also there's an excellent dwelling house for the teacher at the expense of Sir James Grant. It goes on to say that the boys there are taught writing, reading, accounts, Latin and French. They amount from around 50 to 80 children, and they excel in reading the English language grammatically. There's another school established in the town, taught by a woman, and her children in that school number 30 to 40, who constantly attend and are educated in all branches of female education. A brewery was established in this place immediately at the first building of it, on the purpose of keeping the people from drinking spirituous liquors, and it continues to give satisfaction. 2 bakers carry on their profession with success. Butcher's meat can be sold, cheese, various other products. There are 2 or 3 public houses, an elegant townhouse, a prison, and it says, although the prison has been built for some years, very few have been confined within its walls, which is high proof of the good behaviour of the people of Granton. But it finishes this 1793 extract. Granton is on all hands surrounded by the most excellent mosses, affording peats of the best quality, the ashes of which, when mixed with lime, make good manure for potatoes, greens and cabbages. All kind of roots are to be met with here, so it's good growing soil. And it goes on to say that in any part of it grows such good crops as in any other part of the kingdom, which from its former barren state is as incontestable proof of how far the country at large is capable of improvement. That's quite some praise to say that what has been achieved in Granton in 20 odd years is an illustration of what the country can achieve. By the time the second statistical account was published in 1845, those manufacturing aims that had been set up as part of the town's foundation, they hadn't quite worked out, but the town had taken off. It had nearly 1,000 inhabitants by 1845, and it had changed with new schools, new buildings, new churches, new institutions, new businesses. The railway would come in 1863, Queen Victoria would stay in Granton in 1860, and of course, as always, where Queen Victoria went, tourism followed. And we hold records for some of those bodies, churches and institutions that were mentioned in the statistical account, and that's what we're going to look at next. Granton, of course, had a Church of Scotland. The parish, the statistical account talks about the fact that the churches in the parish are not helpfully located for where the most of the population are, and we see that a lot in different statistical accounts. But, so of course they had a Church of Scotland, but I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to look at something that's a little bit more unusual about Granton, which is Granton Baptist Church. We hold copies of a history of Granton Baptist Church written in 1869 by William Grant, who was the third pastor of that church. And he says, "Finding that my predecessors in the pastorate did not keep a regular church book, I endeavour hereby to write up as full and correct a history of this church and its membership until this date, 29th of November 1869, as the materials and experience within my reach admit." At the time of its formation, the whole county was the whole country was in a deplorable state of ignorance and profligacy. Its ministers were thoroughly legal in their preaching and worldly in their lives. The first to disturb this spiritual indifference was William Mackintosh, my maternal grandfather, a man of no regular education, but of natural gifts and some knowledge of the Scripture. He was stirred up to preach from house to house, and frequently preached in the churchyards to the congregation leaving the established church, among whom the minister was often seen listening with as much wonder as the astonished people. He goes on a little bit later to say, "Soon after this, Mr. Haldane of Edinburgh visited and preached in the district, deepening the feelings of discontent with the preaching that they were wont to hear, and enlightening many souls as to the way of salvation and the spiritual value, the spiritual nature of the kingdom." Through the influence of the Haldanes and others, several independent missionaries started to come at intervals into this country, resulting in the formation of a new church. So they form a church and they decide that they're going to split it. It's in the middle. I think it's Rothimarcus that they site the church in, somewhere across the whole district where people can come and visit centrally. But he goes on to say that owing to the great distance and the addition of numbers to the church, so the church is growing in popularity, the church agreed to divide into two parties and form two churches, one in Badenoch and one in Strathspey. The Baptist Church in Granton was accordingly formed in about the year 1805 at August in the house of A. Grant, and consisted of 7 baptised believers. Perhaps the most famous pastor of Granton Baptist Church was Peter Grant, who was born in Strathspey in 1783 and became the church's second minister in 1826. It records that he preached faithfully, fervently and successfully for 61 years, 41 of which were pastor of Granton Church, before dying at the age of 85 and being succeeded by his son, who wrote this history. Now, Peter Grant, or Padraig Grant na Oran, was also a renowned poet, songwriter and musician. He played his fiddle in the church, which would have been very unusual, particularly about, we're just coming up to the time of the disruption, the creation of the Free Church. He had an interesting life, which I might come back to in a future episode. But after meeting in houses for decades, the congregation built a chapel in 1851, funded entirely by donations and subscriptions, and then a manse in 1858. And that Baptist church, founded in around 1805, was to be continued right through to the present day from those early roots. The statistical accounts, as well as speaking about churches and religion and the state of religion in the area, also talk about schools and educational institutions. And we hold the records for Granton Female School, Granton Public School and Granton Grammar. And those schools have amalgamated and changed and merged over the years, and we'll touch on some of that. But the minute book for Granton Female School reveals that in 1858, Captain John Grant had made provision in his will for the establishment of a female school. And this is how the minute book opens. I hereby legate and bequeath the sum of £800 sterling for the purpose of establishing a female school in Granton, of which £400 is to be applied in either erecting or purchasing a suitable house to accommodate both the mistress and the scholars, and the remaining £400 sterling to be lodged in some safe security, and the interest thereof to be uplifted yearly and paid to the mistress as her salary. No scholar is to be paid more than 1 shilling. Is to pay more than 1 shilling. Sorry, I got distracted by Mary's comment there, saying that she struggled to find the episode. So the school is to be established. £400 to be used in either building or buying a property. Another 400 to be put into securities and used to pay the mistress. It goes on to say that all the children should be members of the established church, and they should be gathered from the local parishes of Cromdale, Abernethy, Duthel. So they have this amount of money allocated from Captain James Grant. They added to this about £200 that had been raised at a bazaar of fancy under the direction of the Countess of Seafield, and they opened this female school in 1862. And when you look through the minutes, you can see them kind of allocating, trying to find teachers, trying to decide who's going to be given certain roles. Miss Strachan was unanimously chosen as teacher at the beginning of the minutes. And the school operated for the next few years with some changes, particularly around the ages of pupils that it took in. But of course, it was the 1872 Education Act that changed everything. And in a minute of 1888, the trustees of the female school resolved to transfer the school and the endowments to the school board of Cromdale Parish with several conditions, including that the revenue of the endowment should be used to create bursaries for promising children who had little other means of procuring education. Interesting as well that they note that they wanted to be sure there was a continuation of religious instruction, and you may remember that the Education Act was quite interesting on religious education. The final few pages of this minute book give a very clear summary of the reasons for the complete merging of these schools, noting that prior to the Education Act, Granton had had the grammar school, the female infant school and the West End Free Church school, none of which were the parish school. But that after the Act, and this is a quote, it became manifestly clear to Her Majesty's Inspector and to the school board that the educational interests of the district would be benefited by a fusion, even partial, of the schools. The West End School merged into Granton Grammar not long after the Act, but the board also proposed merging the female school into Granton Grammar. And they note that this is particularly advisable as technically the female school was meant to be under the supervision of the Granton Grammar School headmaster. And they note that this is particularly tricky given that he is in another building some distance away. So on the 16th of April, the trustees of Granton Female Infant School agreed to the transfer, and the school closed not long after with the transfer of pupils. And the female school building, Burnfield House, is now the lovely Granton Museum. Now, within our County of Moray records, now will not have heard me talk about County of Moray records very often, and that's because we don't have that many. But what we do have are the records for the places in Moray which subsequently transferred to Highland. And so we hold the school records for the schools of Granton because Granton came into Highland. I'll come back to that. So we have some admission registers, some logbooks, we have some for the female school, but also other records for Granton Grammar School. And I really enjoyed having a look through these for this episode. The first entry of Granton Grammar School's logbook from October 1874 chimes in with what I just spoke about. It notes that attendance is better than usual on account of the shutting of the West End School. So you can cross-reference all these schools and the mergers and so on. In 1881, which made me chuckle but would not have made me chuckle if I had been involved in the management of it, there are numerous references in the Granton Grammar logbooks to the problems of the school's plumbing. So there are days where there's limited water, there are days when there's no water, and then finally they record their joy that the plumbers have been out and that the water problems have been fixed. But once it's fixed, there's a subsequent entry that says it's been fixed so effectively that the increase in water pressure has burst all the pipes. I was also really interested when I looked through the logbooks for Granton to find that we have logbooks for Granton Evening School, which dates, certainly the logbooks date from 1894 to 1903. And this is the opening entry. October the 26th, 1894. The Evening Continuation School was started on Monday the 22nd of October with a public meeting at which the following members of the school board were present and delivered addresses. Mr. Fleming, the chairman, Reverend Mr. McDermott, Dr. Barclay and Mr. Fraser. 72 pupils were enrolled, 72 pupils in Granton in the evening school. The staff of teachers consists of Mr. Cheney, the head teacher, Mr. Walker, or Walter, Mr. Kerr and Miss Grant. The subjects to be taught are arithmetic, writing and composition, bookkeeping, shorthand, drawing, domestic economy and needlework. The evening instructions are Monday, Tuesday and Thursday from 8 p.m. until 10 p.m. The classes have now been arranged and the subjects introduced. And the logbook kind of details the increase and decrease of attendance, the changes in subjects that were taught. I was really interested to see that in 1895 there was a wood carving for ladies class between 6 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. on Wednesday nights. That was really interesting, that there was felt to be a need for that. So we've looked at the Baptist Church and churches, we've looked at education. If we move away from education now and carry on through time, the next major event in Granton's story comes in 1898 when the town became a police borough, receiving its charter. It's really, really unusual for me to only have borough minutes from that day on, from 1898. It's so late for us to start looking at borough minutes. Most of our boroughs have minutes that start in, the 1600s, 1500s, 1700s and so on. And there would have been volumes before that which just haven't survived. So I actually found it really, really fascinating to look at the Granton minutes because it reveals something that we don't have for those other boroughs. We can see them almost sort of learning to become a borough. The first volume of the Borough Minutes opens with a copy of the Borough Charter, and that charter delineates the borough boundaries very clearly. It gives the population. It says that there are 1,497 people, which means that they can be qualified as a populous area, which means they're eligible to apply for borough status. It gives, as I say, the population at the boundaries, and it records the meeting at which borough status was conferred. So it records what was discussed and what was said and what their case is for applying to become a borough. And then the following pages record the process of setting up a borough, which, as I say, we just don't have for the others. So we can see the appointment of a provost and bailies, Andrew Macpherson Grant being unanimously elected the first provost. We can see the appointment of a clerk to the council, Donald Grant Lawson. Then a collector and a procurator fiscal are appointed. A medical officer, a sanitary inspector, a borough surveyor are all appointed. And then the minutes record the transfer of business and budgets from the county to the borough. And again, it's a county that I don't work with very often because they're part of what would become Murray, but their business is being interacted with Elgin, and they're speaking to Elgin about releasing those records that relate to the running of Granton from the county council over to this newly formed borough council. The next thing we see in the minutes is that it's time to set up committees. So they discuss which committees they're going to need, and they set up a general improvements committee, a public health committee, and so on. The minutes record the standing orders, the rules that would regulate the borough's proceedings, and they detail what the process is going to be for ordinary meetings, for special meetings, including what time they're going to meet, what the order of business should be, and so on. So it's a really interesting insight into the setting up and running and birth of a borough that we don't have for the others. Once everything is up and running, then the minutes turn to the management of that borough, and there are entries about things like pavements and lighting the streets and all manner of different things relating to life in Granton. I particularly like the discussion that they had very early on, within early months of becoming a borough, about naming the streets, because they say this is a usual convention in the boroughs and therefore we should do it, we should name our streets. They request a map of the borough from the Board of Agriculture, and then they set about choosing the street names for Granton. And this is what they decided. It was unanimously agreed that the street from the bridge at the West End to the Caledonian Bank be called High Street, from the Caledonian Bank to the Corner House, the part now known as the Square, to be officially called the Square, and from the Corner House to the East End, the street to be called Castle Road, that the street from the bridge at the West End to the Highland Railway Station be called Woodlands Terrace, that the street from Mr Sharp's property onto the west of the old road near the school on the east be called Woodside Avenue. And it goes on, it lists each street that is in existence and what they think it should be called, and you can see things like the Seafields coming out, Seafield Avenue, Grant Road, those things that are very, very localised, as you will always expect street names to be. But the other thing they did really early on, in the first few months, is they didn't just change the names of the street or give the names the streets official names, they changed the name of the town from Granton to Granton-on-Spey. And this was agreed in a minute on the 14th of November 1898 and was advertised in the Edinburgh Gazette and the Granton Supplement. And on the same day, the borough seal was commissioned, the Grant coat of arms with a river in fess, so a river in a kind of wavy line, and the Grant clan motto, Stand Fast. So you see what I mean? It's the birth of a borough. It's the name, the crest, the structure, the administration, the management, all coming into being. Now, it wasn't that long, of course, before that borough would be thrown into World War I. And I've mentioned before that most boroughs in Highland sit on the coast, and Granton absolutely does not. So Granton's World War I story doesn't involve the coast like many of our others do, but the minutes of both Granton Grammar School and the borough minutes really, really record the impact of the war. Here are just a few extracts from the school minutes, school logbooks first of all. 1916, Miss MacDonald, Class 4, was absent 3 days, Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday of this week. She went home on hearing news of her younger brother having fallen in the war. This is the third member of the staff who has been thus stricken. I mean, 3 members of the staff to immediately be losing family members. And then, headmaster absent from school most of the day, having had an unofficial report that his son, Private Roderick Dewar McLennan, was killed in action on the 25th of September near Lewes. There are entries in the school logbooks that record flag days and fundraising and the collection of sphagnum moss for wound dressing. And I was really interested because I've always known that the Granton Grammar School, many schools collected sphagnum moss, but I knew that it was a big thing in Granton. But to see in that 1793 statistical account that they specifically mention that Granton was surrounded by most excellent mosses, I wonder if they could ever have foreseen quite how important that would be to collect those sphagnum mosses for wound dressings in the First World War. In the 1917 Borough Minutes, we find recorded a plea for men to work in agriculture from the National Service Department. But the town council of Granton reply that the borough is so depleted of men that there is scarcely any such available for you. In 1915, the borough council wrote to Sir Archibald Williamson MP to state that the borough were really keen to have troops billeted in Granton to try and support them. They also petitioned the post office to reduce the rate of postage to soldiers serving on the front. The borough minutes are absolutely permeated with the war. You see it everywhere. There are functions for troops, there are fundraising events, there are flag days, there are entries that talk about members of the borough council going off to serve in the war, and entries recording losses sustained to their family. So for instance, the treasurer's son, Captain Donald Campbell, was killed in action, as well as references to medals that have been won by council staff. So like I say, you see it right throughout the borough minutes. And at the end of the war, I found this really moving and very timely entry in 1918. The Provost proposed the following resolution, which was agreed to. We desire to place on record an expression of profound thankfulness at the cessation of hostilities and the early prospect of an enduring peace. Our sincere gratitude to the brave men who have rendered such immeasurable and noble service and the attainment of a glorious victory. Our feeling of gratification and pride that the men from our own district have borne such a worthy share in this colossal struggle. Our heartfelt sympathy is with all those who have been bereaved, and our ardent hope is that the proposed League of Nations will render impossible the recurrence of such a calamity in the future. And as I've said before, I always find that very, very moving. Those references at the end of the First World War of this desperate hope that such a thing could never happen again. But of course, very similar emotions were experienced through World War II, when the people of Granton again played their part at a local level and at an international level. But to move on to the 1960s, we saw some significant moments in Granton-on-Spey. In 1965, the railway closed, part of those infamous beaching cuts, and also because a more direct line between the north and south had been opened in 1897, so perhaps it was a cut that was always going to come. In 1966, the 12th Countess of Seafield, Nina Ogilvie Grant, formally handed over the square in Granton-on-Spey to the town council. And then in 1975, when local government reforms came into effect, Granton became part of the Badenoch and Strathspey district of Highland region, moving out of Moray. And it has remained part of Highland ever since, although there have been some debates about that in the intervening years. So, as I say, it is unusual in that it keeps that foothold. It's technically part of Highland, but it's got a historic connection to Moray, and it sits between the two, emotionally, I think. The town celebrated its 250th anniversary in style in 2015, its 250th anniversary, and it will mark its 260th next year. As always with the town episodes, I could have said much more. I could have gone into detail about the Ian Charles Hospital or various other aspects of Granton's story. But hopefully it's whetted your appetite. If you don't know Granton, hopefully you know a little bit more about it now. And hopefully you've seen why Granton is a little bit different to the other places that I've talked about in this type of episode. If you want to find out more, then please do come in to the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, have a look at our Granton records. Visit Granton Museum in the old female school building. The Seafield records are National Records of Scotland, reference number GD248. And hopefully that will give you some further things to investigate. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm sorry some of you had a job finding this week's episode. As I said in the 200th, the settings change every week, and I do the same thing every week, and the algorithms have changed everything. So I'm glad that you were able to find me. Hope you can join me next week. We'll be looking at the Banks salmon fishing records from Skye and Lochailsh Archive, and a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland's a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate to our work, then we really appreciate that, and I'll look forward to speaking to you again next week. Thank you.